introduce and get our speaker.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the 2018 All Bugs Good and Bad webinar series. These webinars are brought to you by the Ant, Pest, and Urban IPM Extension Communities of Practice, the Alabama Cooperative Extension System, the University of Georgia Extension, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and Clemson Cooperative Extension. Today we've got Dr. Fudd Graham from the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at Auburn University, and he's also an extension specialist with us here at Alabama Extension. So thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Graham, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Danny and Evan. We'll go ahead and get started here. We're going to talk about several species of ants today, but we're going to begin with Argentines, as the title says. But just a little bit of background on ants. Ants are social insects, and what that tells you is that they have 2 or more generations a year that overlap. They do have adults that care for their young, and the adults are divided into castes. Most of these nests around here are perennial, and they're active all year. Ants have a pretty good ecological impact on the ecosystem. About 35% of all herbaceous plants and seeds are dispersed by ants. They turn more soil worldwide than earthworms do. And they're the predominant insect predators and scavengers that we have out in the field. I know fire ants, which are one of our major pest problems here, are actually one of the best scavengers and predators that we have in cotton fields and in sugarcane productions. But they do have an economic impact too. About 9 out of 10 pest control operators said in 1990 magazine survey that ants were, their calls were on the rise. And they surpassed cockroaches in the late 1990s as the most important pest group that affected pest management professionals in the world. And just this year, Arrow Pest Control Company did a survey and found that ants were the #1 pest concern, according to a survey that they had conducted by a marketing research firm. Now, if we're going to talk about ants a little bit, or any kind of pest in particular, the first thing you need to know is how to identify that pest. And we're not going to go through an ant key today, but there is one thing I wanted to show you when we started out here. The #1 question at the top of an ant key, the first couple that you should come across, is does the ant have 1 node or 2 nodes? And if you'll look at the ant on the left here, this ant on what we call the petiole, which is the narrow region between the thorax here and the gaster on the ant, it has 1 node on it. This ant on the right, between the thorax and the gaster, has 2 nodes. And that's the first question they're going to ask you every time. And as we go through today, you're going to notice that I'll mention that the ants have 1 or 2 nodes, and that will tell you a little bit about them. But again, we're not going to get into ant ID that much today. The Argentine ant is the one we want to pay attention to here at the beginning. This is a serious exotic pest. Like most of our ant pests, it is not from here, but it is from South America. It is a multiple queen ant. They have multiple queens per colony. Most of the time when you're trying to bait Argentines, or you see who they're coming in for food in your home, they're going to prefer sweets. They have variable nests. They may be all out in your yard, and if you do go out and spray, they do have the potential of budding, which is they'll grab a queen, a few ants, go off and start a new colony somewhere else. The Argentine ants only have 1 node, and they have an anal opening that's slit-like. They do not have a sting. They are monomorphic, which means all of their workers are about the same size, and most of the ants are light to dark brown, though when you see them crawling on the sidewalk or against the background, they'll look more dark brown to black. But if you pick some up and take a look, they are lighter brown. One of the things that is characteristic of the Argentine ant is they do have a triangular head, which you can see on the bottom right. They're smooth, they're hairless, they don't really have any setae or hairs on them, and they have a very pointed node that's on the petiole. Ants are one of the species that you can actually pick up the ant, mash it a little bit, and smell, and use smell as one of your identification components of trying to figure out which species you have. And Argentines have a sort of a stale, greasy, musty smell when they're crushed. And if you see these ants most of the time in the summertime when the colonies have built up, they're going to move swiftly on fairly wide trails of about a ½ inch or so. Okay, let's take a look at some research that Dr. Eric Benson and some of his students have done at Clemson University on Argentine ants in the past couple of years, and try to figure out if there's a way we can reduce these numbers in our yards. When you're going out to look for ants in the yard, you need to make an inspection to see what you have out there, and you need to know that ants are going to trail along structural edges, they're going to climb up plants, they're going to go up trees, but they're going to look for lines to go along in the outdoors. And one of the first things you need to determine is if your infestation comes from outdoors. Most of the time with Argentines especially, they don't set up and nest indoors unless you have some wet wood or some place where you have very high humidity and wet conditions, because they need that moisture to survive. One of the things you need to ask yourself is, when do I need to go out to look to see if they're foraging? Do I go in the morning? Do I go in the afternoon? Well, days like today when you've got sun outside and it's a fairly warm day, but it's not going to get that warm, you can pretty much look for Argentines all of the time. But in the summertime, when the temperatures get higher and things get warm, the best time to go look for Argentines is going to be early in the morning or later in the evening. And it really doesn't matter what time you go out. And we're going to get into that just a little bit with some of Eric's research. When you are looking in the yard, one of the places you need to take a look at is to inspect on trees and under mulch and piled objects on the ground. They like to nest under things that trap moisture out of the ground, and they will also climb up in the trees and get honeydew from aphids and any other insects that produce honeydew that you have in your trees. If you're looking for ants, excuse me, along the inside, again, you want to look along those structural guidelines when you're looking in a building, around windows, along edges, along the wall, baseboards, places like that. Same for the outside. When you're looking, those structural lines on buildings are the places that you want to go to look to see if you have ant trails or ant populations out in your yard. That's the first place you go. This blue line here actually is for behind the shrubs along the edge of the building where the building meets the ground. If you're going to go out and do an Argentine treatment, there's some things you should do first. First, you need to look at altering the conducive nesting conditions and foraging sites that you have in your yard. If you take these out and remove their harborage and their food, you can also help to get rid of that population. If you're going out to treat these ants, you need to treat the nest directly with sprays using enough volume. Now, what that's going to entail is you finding that trail of ants wherever it's coming into your home or onto your property, and trailing that ant nest back to multiple nests. Remember, I said that Argentine ants are multiple queened, so you won't spray just one nest. You'll have to look for several all throughout your yard. We like to avoid large perimeter area sprays. A lot of people like to go out and just spray their whole yard for these. I prefer, and much prefer, trailing the ants back to their nest. You can spray along this trail if you want to kill workers as you go, but the best place to basically look to treat these things is at their nest. You can also use baits with targeted treatments with Argentine, and we're going to take a look with some data here to show that you need to focus those treatments early in the spring. This is one of the studies that Dr. Benson did. It's the impact of insecticide spray on non-target terrestrial arthropods while treating for Argentine ants. And I'm going to talk just about a part of this study. He was actually testing some experimental insecticide formulations for control of Argentines in yards and places like that. But he used imidacloprid-based product called Premise 2, and it's what we used as a commercial standard. When we put a test out like this, especially when we're testing experimental products, we like to use a product that we know people are using commercially and then we know works as a standard against these new formulations that we're taking a look at. During this study, Premise 2, surprisingly, the standard provided the best control of Argentine ants compared to all the experimentals that he had. And you can see Eric here spraying the base of the tree from about 5 or 6 feet up until the base. This is where they had their treatment area. A week before the treatment with the Premise around these trees, the Argentines were actually the most abundant species that were collected at both the treatment site and the control site. Doesn't surprise me. Argentines are like fire ants. Whenever they're in an area, they're usually the predominant species. But once they put the treatment out, throughout that duration of their post-treatment evaluations, which went about 12 weeks, the Argentine ants were the only ant species that were collected in the control site. So nothing's basically changed in the control site, and the Argentines were the predominant ant there. In the treatment sites, however, the Argentine numbers decreased to a low of 0 in some plots, while there was a corresponding increase in basically the diversity and the number of other ants that were in the area. For the 12-week post-treatment period, the ants of 5 different genera were picked up in the treated areas, with thief ants being the most abundant. But there were Paratrichinas, Phodoles, Solenopsis, which those of you know could be fire ants, and a couple of others. But after the chemical treatment, the original pest may rebound. So Argentines are going to come back. Or you may have a new pest ant move in to the area, such as fire ants, as I mentioned. Or there's a third alternative that can happen, and it happens a lot of times, and we've had this show up at a cemetery in South Alabama where we treated for fire ants. You get a more diverse complex of ant genera that may come into the area, and actually these may be beneficial and may not be cause any pest problems at all. But each of these is going to result in a situational scenario that you need to go out, take a look at, and consider before making any subsequent pesticide or insecticide applications. Let's take a look at another study that they did at Clemson. This is Jimbo Song. This was his PhD dissertation that he did when working for Eric Benson, and he took a look at managing Argentine ants with early season baiting in a South Carolina state park. In South Carolina, just like here in Alabama, state parks are areas that have widespread and serious pest problems with Argentine ants. We actually went down to Mayer State Park in Baldwin County last summer because they had a terrible Argentine ant problem that we actually thought when we first got there, since they had such high numbers, were Tony crazy ant population, but it was not. It was an Argentine ant population. The problem is the park staff is going to go out and they're going to use a variety of sprays, baits, and basically these guys really aren't familiar with the ants, they aren't familiar with their behavior, and they often end up with poor control during the camping season, even though they're putting out large amounts of product during the summer. And then again, you're going to have your campers come in. They're going to use a variety of their own insecticides, cleaning products, and that is one thing they use. One of the things they told us at Mayer State Park that a lot of the campers use was Comet Cleaner that people use in their sinks at home. And they bring their own home remedies to control these Argentine ants in the parks also. So what he wanted to do is take a look and see if they could affect some of these large populations in the state park. He went out and he placed some environmental stations in the park. These were hooked up to these hobo monitors here, which are very good at picking up environmental conditions on a local scale. They record relative humidity and temperature and do a good job of it. And then they put out sugar baits. And what they were wanting to take a look at in this study is when the ants started foraging in the springtime, so they would know when to put out baits at an optimal time. And if you look at the average number of ants on the side here from January 19th until March the 15th, you can see numbers start to kick up around here between February 23rd and March 1st. This coincides, if you look on the right over here, the temperature maximum is in the blue, the temperature minimums were in the red, at a time around in February where the average temperatures during the daytime were 55 degrees or higher. And that's what they determined was the best time to go out and start baiting Argentine ants was when temperatures, especially ambient temperatures, got above 55 degrees. But what they wanted to know is when to start baiting in the spring. So what they did is they got liquid ant baits. This is Max Force Quantum ant bait. They took it and they diluted it with 25% sugar water and then placed this diluted bait into a KM ant probate station. This holds about a liter of the liquid. Then they placed these in the park and they put out 9 bait stations in 3 rows, 20 meters apart. Now, Eric told me when we were talking about this that the original objective of this was to put the bait stations at the base of trees. But what he found out is that this placing bait stations 20 meters apart worked very well, and he's decided to recommend that rather than going for the bait stations at the base of the trees. And then they counted the number of ants going up and down the trees, and we'll get into how they did that in a second. But here you can see the bait stations out in the park. He said there was no problem with this, except if you've ever done an experiment out in a public area. People tended to go out and see the bait stations, take a look at them, pick them up, do things with them. So some were moved at times. But this is the only real problem they had with setting this out. If you'll take a look at the data that they got, the blue line here are the number of ants in the treated area of the park. The red line above is the number of areas in the untreated portion of the park. Now, in this untreated portion, they did actually put out sugar bait, but they had no insecticide in it. After they got the bait out and they came in around March, if you remember the earlier graph with the temperatures, March was the time the temperatures got to be above 55 degrees. They went out and counted ant trails going up and down the trees, and what they would do is find the heaviest ant trail on the tree, and they would sit there for 30-second intervals and count the ants going up and down. And they did these treatment tests from March through October, and you can see that if you start baiting early here in March, that all through the summer you can get fairly decent control of Argentine ants if you start in the summer. What we found out here in Alabama, and Eric said it's the same up in Clemson too, is that if you wait till later in the summer when these ant populations get up and they get very high, that it's difficult at that point in time with large numbers of ants to try to go out into the field and use a bait and control these ants. There are just too many ants at that time to be able to put out enough bait to be able to take care of them. So if you take a look at a summary of what he did with the experiment, when the minimum temperature continued to be over 55 degrees in a week, that's the best time to start setting out your bait stations in the spring. It was good to see this work from Eric, because we were actually considering this and wanting to try this with Tawny crazy ants down in South Alabama, where we have a fairly good population of this new invasive species. But they found out from March until October of 2012, the mean number of ants was reduced in the Greenwood State Park in South Carolina when compared to the untreated plots. Now, as with fire ants and other ants and everything else, in 2013, what they found out was they didn't go out and do treatments again at the beginning of the spring the next year. The Argentine ants gradually increased in the treated plots as compared to those same treated plots in 2012. So the ants started increasing in number again. So Argentines, like many other things, is one of those pests that you can't treat them once and be done. There's no once and done solution for Argentine ants. Again, these bait stations were placed 60 feet apart. Eric and them found out that this may be a more feasible control method for Argentine ants if you put them out in natural settings, and that the early season baiting appears to be much more effective overall than baiting later in the year when the populations have gotten very high. There's a couple of other ants I want to mention. I mentioned a while ago that if you're going to work with a species, you need to know a little bit about it and its biology. And the next study we've got is going to cover not only Argentines, but the odorous house ant here. It's one that could be easily sometimes confused with the Argentine. It's about the same size. It's dark. It has monomorphic workers. Again, it's brown to black. But instead of that greasy, stale smell that I mentioned with Argentine ants, the odorous house ant has a rotten coconutty smell when crushed. If any of you remember the old coconut sun tanning oils that they used to sell on the shelves when people wanted to get dark rather than to have SPF and suntan oils now to keep you from getting burned. This is the smell of those old sun tanning lotions that you used to have. But they do have a distinctive odor when crushed. And these, like the Argentines, are fairly fast moving and move along a trail. Again, like the Argentines, they're fairly hairless and don't have anything there. But the one thing that you can take a look at to tell the difference between the Argentine ant and the odorous house ant, since they only have one node, is that the Argentine has this pointed node that you see on the right, while the odorous house ant has a more flattened node that's actually difficult to see sometimes when you try to look at it with a magnifying glass or under a scope. The key points to remember about them, they make numerous shallow nests outdoors. Sometimes they will nest indoors, and you're going to see a pattern here that most of our ants come in from outdoors. They aren't indoor nesters. These guys will take sweet baits. They have strong foraging trails again, and you can use these to follow them back to their colonies. The other ant we're going to take a look at in this study is the Asian needle ant. As far as I know, we don't have this in large numbers in Alabama. I think there have been one or two references to them showing up here in Alabama. These ants have a fairly good sting. They are dark in color with more brown to orangish legs and mandibles, and about the same size as a medium-sized fire ant. They lack spines, and they also have monomorphic workers. And one of the key characteristics that I found interesting when I was looking into these guys is if you really want to try to identify the Asian needle ant, it said to drop them into a glass. They have an inability to cling to smooth surfaces like glass, and basically they'll try to climb up the side for a couple of times and then they'll just stay down in the bottom. So I've never used the glass jar test to identify ants before, but it looks like that might work pretty good. So one of Eric's students, Jennifer Newman, worked on her master's degree project taking a look at the activity and resource extraction by Argentine ants as compared to these two species that we just talked about. And again, if you look at the Asian needle ants, it's going to be larger than the Argentine. It feeds on dead insects. And again, it has a large stinger, and it's a strong chemical defense. Everybody that's told me that they have been stung by an Asian needle ant said it was a very painful sting, much worse than fire ants. If you take a look at the odorous house ant, again, it's going to be similar in size, similar in food preference, and similar in nest habitats to the Argentine. So what her objective was in this study was to determine the activity and attraction to food sources of these three ants in a natural environment. And what she assumed and her hypothesis was that each species would be attracted to and prefer one type of food consistently throughout a 24-hour period. So what she did is she went out and she found 5 nest openings per species. And folks, if you haven't looked for ants in the field, that's a fairly difficult thing to do with some of these, to be able to find 5 good nest openings in an area that small enough that you can do a study in. And she presented her feed choices on a CD. So if you've got old CDs you want to throw away and you're thinking about working with ants, you can save them so you can have some test materials to put your baits out on. But she located these CDs about 50 centimeters from a nest opening, and she used several different feed sources on there. The first she used was what was called a multiple species ant attractant that has been developed. They used honey, apple jelly, frozen mealworm, peanut butter, and tuna. And she had a pretty good study going here because she looked at these every 20 minutes, for 20 minutes, every 4 hours, and she did this over a 24-hour period. What she found out was that the Argentine ant is going to remain active pretty much 24 hours a day as long as it's not too hot and they stay out of the sun. They were usually the fastest to the food source of the 3 species of ants. And believe it or not, everybody thinks they're sugar eaters, but they visited the tuna and the multiple species ant attractant first, and they tended to recruit to the tuna. The odorous house ant was actually active between about 800 and 2,200 hours. I think that's 8 a.m. in the morning, and we'll go to about 8 o'clock at night. And these guys were the slowest to the food source. And they tended to visit the jelly first. They tend to be sweet eaters, and they said they never went to the peanut butter first. But they recruited equally well to tuna, honey, and jelly. For the Asian needle ants, again, they were active 24 hours a day. They visited the tuna and the multiple species ant attracted first. They did not recruit well to these, and they preferred tuna and the peanut butter. But what she found out with her study is that these ants have food preferences that change, not only over time, but usually within a nest in a 24-hour period. And they also change between nests of the same species. So the take home from this is that knowing the biology of the ant that you're working with is important for the control of that species. And if you're going out and doing baiting to try to take out some of these ants, do not limit yourself to one time of day or to one food source when you're going out to treat these ants. Some of the newer ant products now have multiple attractants in them, but the three things that ants usually are looking for are sugar or protein or sometimes are fat or lipid. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about carpenter ants. These are the large black ants that you see coming in the house. They have one node, and they have a group of hairs around their pseudopore. These are fairly large ants. They nest in hollow cavities in old trees outside above the ground. They will nest in wood piles, but they're going to be somewhere where there's old rotten wood around that they can live in. They may produce frass consisting of sawdust, dead insects, and pupal cases that you can actually see outside of their nests, especially if you're looking in your yard in old stumps or trees. This is one of the things that you can look for to indicate that you do have a carpenter ant nest in there. Usually they're scavengers, predators, and most of the time they tend to be sweet loving. And you can notice on this difficult to bait, I have a star by that. This was basically the common thought for several years, but Dan Suter's done some work over in Georgia, and he's proved that you can do a pretty good job with baits to take out carpenter ants. So what we want to do now is take a look at one of Dan's studies on carpenter ants, biology and baiting that he did over in Georgia. And this is work that he did over several years. This is a combination on this presentation of several studies that he's done over there. One thing to note is that the carpenter ant, especially the black carpenter ant, it does chew wood, but it doesn't eat it. A lot of people want to think that carpenter ants are like termites. They bore into the woods, they tear it up, and they eat wood, but carpenter ants don't. Most of the time when you find carpenter ants in wood, they're going to be into older, maybe rotten wood or wood that has been wet and is starting to decay. Most of the time, these guys are going to nest outdoors, in trees, and they will create permanent trails. This is one of the species that if you want to go out and try to find where they're coming from and where they're going, you're going to have to do a night search, because most of the time these guys are active at night. And the best way to control them is to find the colony or the most likely site and then provide a gel bait or a granular bait. You can see here some of the sawdust looking material that they throw out of the nest when they're chewing the wood and opening it up to form brood chambers and queen chambers to take care of the young in the nest. Outdoors, carpenter ants are going to nest mainly in those large hardwood trees. I found them in stumps. I found them in trees that are dead. Anywhere outside that you have old wood or wood that's not in good shape that they can get behind and chew and make their nest. You can see here where they go into a root that has a hole in it. They like hardwood trees, preferably. If you have firewood outside or any old cut limbs, you can see carpenter ants going in and out of this hole on a tree and actually see the frass on the outside of this hole in this cut tree limb here. They also usually form fairly obvious long trails in your yard. You can see the one here between the two trees going from one where we assume the nest is and far back to the tree here in the near foreground. The trails can be long in your yard too. We found fire ants will forage 200, 250 feet. I followed trails that long beside chicken houses before, at least halfway down the chicken house. So I know they'll go up 250, 300 feet. But Dan's found that these carpenter ants will move about at least 120 feet along the trail back to the tree where the colony lives. And like other ants that we talked about earlier, these guys are going to follow structural guidelines in your yard. They'll come up, walk on top of the fence here, go backwards the same way. Going to and from a garbage can, they're going to have a fairly good, well-marked trail out here in the woods. And they use trees going up and down those. So the ants basically come out of here, hit their solid structural guidelines, and go from there. I mentioned that carpenter ants forage mostly at night. Dan also did a study taking a look at the time of day that ants were active. And basically they used lights, but you can see here that the ant numbers increased when the amount of light decreased, and they were more active between 6 o'clock in the afternoon until around 5 or 6 in the morning. That's when you had your darkest time of the day, and that's when the ants were most active. Recurred fairly common throughout the time. So these guys are night foragers, and if you really want to find where they're coming from, this is the best time to go take a look for them. Have a good flashlight when you go out there. You can see here they were out looking in the dark that afternoon. Dan went out, took some ants, painted some of them blue, and then when it got dark, he followed them along the trails, and they ended up back in the kitchen where they'd been causing a problem. So he's done a couple of studies to make sure that these guys can walk that far, and he knows they can. So let's take a look at baiting some of these carpenter ants now, and some of the products that he used. The first gel bait that he used was Adbion ant bait gel. It has indoxacarb as its active ingredient. And this is one of the products that I mentioned earlier. This has both sugar and a protein base to it, so it attracts ants that like both of these as a food source. You can see here he put the ant bait gels out, and carpenter ants were very attracted to it. Here's another picture of them on a tray eating and coming to the baits. He tried another gel bait, OptiGuard, which has thiamethoxam as its active ingredient. Again, it is a sugar-based bait. And you can see here the ants came to this gel and apparently liked it very well. He also mixed up some borate baits. The first borate bait he mixed up worked very well. The second did not work as well. This looks like it has more boric acid in it than the other did, and sometimes if you get your boric acid too concentrated, the ants are not as attracted to it as they are with the one with the lower concentration. They have to carry more back to the nest to spread the active ingredient through the mound. Here's another borate bait that they came to. I think this is bait number 1. They also like Max Force carpenter ant gel bait. You can see the gel bait here in the trays where he put out, where he placed it in the field. This is a typical location on where he put the baits in the field. The nest for the carpenter ants was in this large tree here. The bait was placed here at the base of the tree. And after they put the Max Force bait out and left it for a while, they had over 1,000 plus dead carpenter ants around this tree. What Dan suggested, though, is when you do put out baits in your yard or wherever the ants are causing places, that you deliver the granular baits or the gel baits on trails or near the nest where the ants are located. One thing Dan did mention, if you take the baits and don't put them along the trails like he did here and move it over to the side, the ants don't tend to find the bait very well if it's not along the trails that they're accustomed to using to get inside homes or other places like that. But one of the things he wanted to stress for sure is that given the quality of today's carpenter ant baits, you can eliminate your carpenter ant problem if you do a good job of using baits and place it in the locations that the ants will find it and will take it back to their nests. I had to leave this one in here. This is not my slide. I'll credit Dr. Benson for this one, but he said successful ant control is like politics. I guess appropriate for now. He said the first thing you need to do is know your audience, which he meant you need to go out and figure out which species of ant is causing the problem and which species of ant you need to prepare for and know their biology and which type of bait that they need. And you also need to know whether you have just one species or that there's several species you have in the yard causing your problems. He also said you need to know their needs, just like a politician needs to know the needs of the guys that elected him. What type of season do they are they most numerous in? When do they like to forage? Remember, with the Argentines, the numbers are low in the springtime, so if you want to bait, that is the best time to try to do that. Later in the summer, when their numbers get up, it's really not feasible to try to bait them at that time. How big is the colony? Again, are you working with a small colony early spring, or do you have a large colony that's built up later in the summer? And what are the habits of these ants? What do they like to eat? Where do they like to trail? Where do they like to live? This will help you try to solve your problem and get rid of the ants over the summer. Then you need to develop and deliver the platform, he says. That's your ant program. It's going to be situational. Where are your ants? How much problem are they causing? Do you need to diversify your methods? Do you need to not only use baits, but some type of topical insecticide in conjunction with the bait? If you do, you need to make sure that you use your baits and topicals together, not put the baits on top of the topical, because if you do, the ants won't come to the bait. The topical insecticide will tend to keep the ants from finding the bait. You don't want to have any distraction around. You don't want to have any non-targets that you kill. Only thing you want to take care of when you're in the yard is the pest species that you have. And then don't have any false expectations. I've talked to pest management professionals and to homeowners that I've taken a look at their ant problems. And pretty much one of the things I tell them all the time is you'll probably have to call me back, because usually getting rid of a good ant population the first time with one treatment is not going to happen. And then you need to conduct polls. You got to see how you're doing, whether your program's going to work well. So you need to go back, take a little trip back to your site and see if you've done a good job short term taking care of the ants, and then go back later. Make sure the ants are still not there. One of the ways to do that is to use monitors. There's several different types of ant monitors that you can use to check and attract ants to them and see how many ants are in the area. There are a few other ants I want to cover real quick here at the end that we get calls about. These, I don't have that much on control of these ants, but this is one that you really don't want to control that much. It's a pyramid ant. It's a, as you can see, a redder colored ant. It's a fairly medium to large size ant. You'll find them in your yard, but most of you are familiar with their nest. They look like little volcanoes sitting in the front yard. For myself, and I don't know about Dr. Benson or Dan Suter and some of the others, I have never seen anyone have a problem with pyramid ants in their homes today. But I have had several people call me up and they want me to tell them how to get rid of the pyramid ants in the yard. The main reason is they think that the mounds that shape like these little volcanoes out in the yard are unsightly, and they don't want them in the yard, and they want to try to take out an ant species at that point in time that's probably doing them way more good than say a few holes in their edge of their lawn is going to harm them. Another ant that causes us problems around here is the acrobat ant, the chromatogaster species. These again are very similar to Argentine ants. They're little small dark ants, But one of the things you'll notice is their abdomen here. They have a fairly heart-shaped abdomen. Doesn't show up as well in this drawing as it will a little bit when I show some pictures from above. But they're monomorphic, like I said, just about the size of an Argentine. These, on the other hand, are two-node ants. You can see here, they don't have one, they have two nodes. I mentioned the heart-shaped abdomen, and they have spines here on the thorax. These are fairly common ant. They move into the north door of my building every summer, and I have to get rid of them. They recur on every year, come back probably midsummer, and I'm sure I'll have to bait them on that north door again this summer. Some of the key points to show you about the acrobat ants, you can see much better in these photos here, the heart-shaped abdomen. It's very obvious once you notice. These guys nest in trees and wall voids. Again, like carpenter ants, they like holes in trees. If they're in a wall void in a home or a shed, it's probably going to be one that has some kind of moisture problems. These guys, like Argentines also, are honeydew feeders. They're going to find aphids and other insects that produce honeydew in your yard and go tend them. They prefer high moisture areas in your structures. And they have really strong trails, just like the Argentines do. And you can follow these back to the nest and be, if you want to treat the nest site directly, or if you want to go back and put your baits next to the nest where it can be more effective also. The final ant that I want to mention today is a little black ant, Monomorium minimum. These guys are very small. Approximately 2 millimeters. If you get out a ruler and take a look at that, that's not very big at all. These guys don't travel in large trails. You'll usually see them 1s and 2s on your countertop. They're minute, again, 1/16 of an inch at the most. Like the other ants we've talked about, they are monomorphic. They have all of the workers being the same size. I mentioned they have 2 nodes. We didn't talk about pharaoh ants today, but they're almost identical to pharaoh ants except for the color. They're hard to distinguish between the two. But these guys are outdoor nesters, whereas pharaohs will be inside. And this little black ant can sting. It's so small that sting's probably just going to be more of an annoyance than anything else. And they have small mounds that are out in the yard, and sometimes they're confused with fire ant mounds that are just beginning because they do create little bits of soil and pile up that looks just like a beginning fire ant mound in the grass in your yard. If any of you are interested in identifying any of the ants that you find or want to know where to go to find good keys to identify ants, Joe McGowan from Mississippi State has one of the best sites that I've ever seen. Joe has good pictures in here. He has good ant keys set up. And when you go through the keys, you don't have to look at drawings that say, well, maybe that's it or maybe it's not. Joe has actual pictures of insects and pen specimens that he has, and he does a good job of describing these ants. So if you want to look up some of these ants, find out what they look like and find a little bit more about them, go to Joe's site, and you can, if you don't know what your ant is, this is a good place to try to key it out from. And with that, guys, I think we've covered most of the ants this afternoon that we can get in for one webinar. And I'll be glad to answer any questions if you've got any in the chat box.
We've got a couple questions. One was, how far north have the Argentine ants migrated? Is this mainly a concern for the Gulf states, or do folks in Missouri, Illinois, or Iowa need to look out for these as well?
I think this is going to be like some of our roaches and some of our other ants. These ants are from Argentina. And I know fire ants have only gotten up to about Nashville. Argentines, I'm not sure about. Fire ants have gotten up along the East Coast to about Virginia. Most of the time it's on the coastline, not where you have cold snaps in the middle. And I'm gonna guess that the range of the Argentines are gonna be similar to what we have for the fire ants too, and that probably with the cold weather that you have up further north that the Argentines probably wouldn't be able to make it through the winter with the frozen ground and snow. But we didn't think fire ants were going to get this far north either, so we'll see.
And then earlier in the presentation, you showed a photo of ants on a bee. Are Argentine or any other ants a threat to pollinators?
The ant on the bee was shown because there's probably a dead bee on the sidewalk somewhere. I mentioned they were scavengers. But yes, ants can be threats to pollinators, mainly for honeybee hives. A lot of beekeepers have to treat the, most of them have high frame bases that they put up with 4 legs going down. And there are times when Argentines, fire ants, and other species of ants that may get in fairly large numbers will get up into the beehives and try to harvest some of the honeys. So with honeybee hives and honeybee producers, there are several species of ants that can cause problems. Most of our native bees and either honeybees out in the wild, that's usually not much of a problem.
All right, any other last minute questions? Just ask in the Q&A box.
Evan, while you're waiting on questions, I'm going to launch a quick poll.
We got another question. How do you identify the queens?
The queen is going to be a much larger ant than the workers. And the other ants, if you get into a nest and open it up, the other ants are going to protect that queen. So if you see a large ant when you open up a mound or a nest, and the other ants are tending to hang around that large ant, basically the other ant workers are going to protect her. So she looks just like the other ants most of the time, except she's just larger and has a much distended abdomen because most of their abdomens are full of eggs.
Do the majority of the ants that you showed sting or bite?
Only two that I showed, I think. The little black ant can sting, but honestly, you probably wouldn't notice it if it did because it's so small. The Asian needle ant that I talked about today packs a powerful wallop. The department head up at Clemson, Dr. Pat Zungoli, told me about her experience getting stung actually in her front yard, and she said her arm hurt for about 2 days afterward and throbbed for about the first 12 to 18 hours. So that particular one has a fairly bad sting with some fairly toxic venom. But those are the only two that I think I covered today that really have stings. The others are basically have pores at the end of their gaster and no sting whatsoever.
Is there a good way to keep ants out of hummingbird feeders?
The best way probably is to try to put some Vaseline has worked pretty good, something to keep the ants from crawling up, or try to put some kind of a barrier on your pole or coming down from the top. I'm trying to think what people have used besides Vaseline to get in there, but I know Vaseline's one that will work pretty good if you coat it fairly well, and the ants get stuck and they can't cross. That's something you'll have to repeat probably on a weekly basis, depending on how much rain you get and how much dust. Once it gets dusty, they can crawl across.
Are there any types of ant baits that work better than others?
That's yes and no. It depends on what the ant wants to eat that day. That's what the young lady's research showed. That's why I like a couple of the ant baits that Dan mentioned. They carry multiple nutrients that the ants like Advion, I know, is a protein bait mixed with a sugar bait. But the best way to find out is to, and most of them are going to like sugar baits. But the best way to find out is to put some ant bait in the front of the trail. And if you're going to bait ants, that's where you need to put the baits. It's find the ant trail and put the bait right along the trail so they'll run into it. But most of the time, your sugar bait should work with the species that we mentioned today, even though her study showed they didn't pick it up. Preferentially, if that's all they got, they'll come to it and they will pick it up. And then the other key to notice, if you put ant bait out and you notice they don't come to it, switch. Or try it again next week. They may have changed what they're eating at that point in time. Don't throw it away.
Do you have any recommendation for preventing infestations if there is no evidence of a nest?
For these ants, no, I don't. I'm assuming you're not. I guess the question is, the person that asked it, are they seeing ants at that point in time, or they just want to have a preventative?
It sounds like that there's evidence of an infestation. They just can't locate where it's coming from.
That means you got to get out and do some work and follow those trails back to find the nest. That's the best way to get rid of ants, is to go back and find the nest. You kill the queen, you kill the mound most of the time. And with some of these, there are multiple queens, so you got to find more than one nest. And think about this too. When you go out and you're working, it's not again, I mentioned this earlier in the talk, it's not a one and done thing. Most of the time, if you spray ants later, they're going to start coming back again because you did not get all of those multiple queens out there. They've laid more eggs, they've recruited, they're coming back again. So you're going to have to do this 2, 3, 4 weeks, going out looking for those mounds. Looking for those trails and following them back to the mounds and nests until you get rid of them. It's everybody wants a one and done, but that's not going to happen most times.
One of our viewers had house ants that showed up in early March, and they've tried some different types of insecticides but can't seem to kill off the colony. And they can't find any trails outside, but they're wondering if you have any suggestions for control.
Is that odorous house ants or just?
Yes.
Two things. Odorous house ants are ones that do like sugar baits. If you're using boric acid baits, they're going to take a while to work. There are other sweet baits out there. Advion and Doxycarb is one of them, that they work faster. Max Force works faster. But I would try to put baits out along the trails. And honestly, if you're having problems like that, you're probably going to have to go outside and find where that nest is coming from. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes. We looked at one home for 6 months before we found out how the ants were getting into it. We happened to walk by the air conditioner unit one day at just the right time, and there was a broken piece of insulation on one of the pipes going into the house. And we happened to see an ant crawl from one side of that broken piece of insulation to the other and go back under the other side and head into the house. For 6 months, they had been crawling up in the air conditioner, getting under the insulation and crawling hidden into the house. And if we hadn't been at the right place at the right time, we wouldn't have found them. So going out and doing really good inspection and finding where they are, or and when they come in the house, that's the best time to trail. Once you get them inside the house, you see them in your kitchen or wherever they're coming in, that's the time to follow that trail. They're going to be recruiting to whatever came into your house, you have in your house that they like that particular day, whether it's an insect that flew in and died in the corner or a cookie crumb that somebody dropped on the counter. They've got a food source, and that's the best time to follow them back to that nest, is when they're trying to harvest that food source.
We've got another question. What is the best way to get rid of fire ants?
Baits. That's a whole nother webinar. I think there's one up there. But baits are the best way to get rid of fire ants. They are single queen mounds, not multiple queens like the one we talked today. And when you kill the queen, you kill the mound. And baits work well 12 months out of the year if you do individual mound treatments. If you're broadcasting, now is the time you can start putting out broadcast applications in your yard and go on till about October 15th. Individual mound treatments, like I said, year round. But baiting is the best way to get rid of a fire ant. Let them do the work for you, carry that bait back, kill the queen, kill the mound.
Are there any other bugs or something similar that will eat ants?
Yeah, they're, for fire ants they are, and from some other native ants around here, they're little flies called forward flies. They're parasitoids of fire ants, and there's some that are parasitoid of native ants. We released a bunch of those in Alabama. They lay their egg into the ant's thorax. When the egg hatches out, little maggot crawls up in the ant's head, lives there for about 5 weeks, eats the inside of the ant's head out, and makes the ant's head fall off, and then uses the ant's head for his pupal container. And about a month and a half later, from the time that egg was laid, you got a new fly coming out looking for more ants to lay eggs in. I do know that we have released those on fire ants, and there are several species that Dr. Sanford Porter caught up here that are native forward flies that attack some of our native ants. So that is one that I know of. And actually, fire ants are actually some of the best control for fire ants, because when a new queen flies into an area that there are other ants using that area, they will try to kill that new queen before she can set up a mound.
Are crazy ants moving north?
We don't know. Right now, they're along the coast. The furthest north I know that we have that a population is in northern Louisiana, right near the Arkansas border. I don't know whether that's an anomaly. We don't know how there. But for most of the rest of the country right now, from about Brownsville, Texas, all the way around to Savannah, Georgia, they're in the first few counties around the coast or around the port where they came in. Next question is, how far north will they go? Based on studies where they've looked at the temperatures that they like in South America, we figure somewhere between Montgomery and the Tennessee line in Alabama. There's actually a paper out there that Danny McDonald did that shows this. But we didn't think fire ants were going as far north as they have. So honestly, the answer is we know where we expect them to go, but how far can they go? We don't know.
All right. Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions, and thanks for everyone participating who asked questions. We are just about out of time for this webinar, but thank you so much for participating. And next month on May 4th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be presenting a webinar on everything you must know about fleas. So put that on your calendar, and we hope that we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Fudd. That was awesome.
Thank you, ma'am. It was fun. It's not so bad.
All right, I'll see y'all in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Get ready for Carrie.